They say marriage is built on trust, but what happens when that trust is nothing more than an illusion, a carefully constructed mask hiding betrayal? Let me take you straight into the heart of my story, because if you've ever felt underestimated, betrayed, or pushed into a corner, then you'll understand why I'm telling you this. And before I dive deep, let me say this: if stories of resilience, shocking twists, and poetic justice resonate with you, don't forget to subscribe to this channel, because what happened to me will leave you thinking for days. It all began on a quiet morning, the kind where the sun seemed a little too bright for the heaviness in my chest. My wife of 12 years, let's call her Melissa, was sitting at the breakfast table across from me, her eyes fixed on her phone, barely acknowledging my presence. It had been months of distance, arguments over little things, and cold silences stretching longer than the nights. I had thought it was just the natural strain of marriage, something we could fix if we worked on it. But that morning, Melissa looked at me with a calmness that felt colder than any storm, and she said words I'll never forget: "I want half of your business. If you don't give it to me, I'll take it through court." At first, I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. My business wasn't just a company, it was my life's work. I had started it from scratch, back when we barely had enough money to pay rent. I had spent sleepless nights drafting plans, pitching ideas to investors who slammed doors in my face, hustling with nothing but grit and hope. And now, Melissa, who had shown little interest in the business itself, who never asked about late nights, who never offered to read a proposal or brainstorm solutions, suddenly wanted half of it as if she had built it brick by brick with me. I asked her why now, why after all these years? She looked at me with an icy stare and said, "Because I deserve it. Because being your wife means I sacrificed for you. And now, it's my turn to collect." The word stung like acid. Collect. As if our marriage had been some kind of transaction, as if love was a ledger and she had been waiting to cash in. I tried to reason with her, to remind her that we could work on things, that money wasn't the solution to whatever void she was trying to fill. But she wasn't interested in working things out, her mind was made up. Within weeks, papers were filed. She wanted half ownership of my business, claiming that she had contributed indirectly, that without her support, I never could have built it. The truth was, her support had vanished years ago, replaced by criticism and demands. Yet now she painted herself as the silent partner who had sacrificed dreams for me. The courtroom became the battlefield, and I walked in prepared for a fight I never thought I'd have against the woman I once loved. But what Melissa didn't know was that I had something she couldn't predict, evidence of her secret, a truth that would turn the tide in my favor, and when the judge saw it, he wouldn't just rule against her, he would laugh at the audacity of her lies. When the divorce hearings began, I could feel every pair of eyes in that courtroom weighing me, judging me, not just as a husband, but as a man. Melissa arrived with a sharp suit, an expensive lawyer, and the kind of smug confidence that comes from believing the system was already leaning in her favor. She walked in like she owned the place, head held high, lips curled into a faint smile, and when she glanced at me, it was as if she was already celebrating her victory. I knew what she thought, that she had me cornered, that the judge would simply nod along when her lawyer painted her as the long-suffering wife who had given up everything for my career. Her opening statement was laced with emotional manipulation. Her lawyer stood up and declared in a booming voice that Melissa had been the backbone of my success, that she had endured countless lonely nights while I built the company, and that she had supported me emotionally in ways that were immeasurable but invaluable. I sat there in silence, my hands folded, watching Melissa dab fake tears from her eyes, and I realized just how far she had strayed from the woman I once knew. This wasn't about truth or fairness anymore, it was about greed dressed up as sacrifice. My lawyer leaned in and whispered, "Let her dig her own grave." And that's exactly what happened. Because while Melissa was busy weaving her narrative of devotion, she had no idea that the very secrets she thought were buried deep would soon be dragged into the light. The judge listened carefully, scribbling notes while Melissa's lawyer dramatically waved his hands, trying to paint me as an ungrateful man who owed his fortune to a loyal wife. He kept repeating phrases like, "silent partner," and "unrecognized contribution," phrases meant to stick in the judge's mind like glue. And for a while, I'll admit, I felt a knot of fear in my chest. What if the judge believed her? What if, despite all my work, all my sweat and sleepless nights, the court really handed over half my business to someone who never lifted a finger to build it? But fear quickly turned into focus. I remembered the evidence sitting in the neat folder inside my briefcase, a 2-page document that could unravel her entire facade in seconds. And the thought of it gave me strength. When it was my turn, I stood up slowly, and I looked not just at the judge but at Melissa. Her eyes narrowed, but her lips twitched nervously for the first time. I began calmly, recounting the truth of my journey. How the business was started in a dingy 1-bedroom apartment, how I worked nights while she complained about me not being home, how she mocked me during my failures instead of encouraging me. I didn't raise my voice, didn't dramatize, I simply told the truth with the weight of lived experience behind it. The courtroom grew quiet, the kind of silence that falls when people realize they're hearing something raw and real. Melissa shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her earlier confidence draining slowly. Still, I could see her thinking she could talk her way out of it. And then came the moment. My lawyer handed me the folder, and I pulled out the 2-page document. The judge raised his eyebrows, intrigued, as I asked permission to submit it as evidence. Melissa's lawyer immediately objected, but the judge waved him down, curious to see what I had brought. I handed the papers over, and the judge began reading. At first, his face was expressionless, scanning line by line. Then, suddenly, a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. By the time he reached the 2nd page, he let out a short laugh, the kind of laugh that carried both disbelief and recognition of the audacity in front of him. The entire courtroom stirred, whispers breaking out as Melissa's face drained of color. She knew exactly what those papers were, and she knew that her carefully constructed house of lies was about to collapse in front of everyone. The judge set his glasses down slowly after finishing the 2nd page, still shaking his head with a half-smile, as if he could hardly believe what he had just read. He looked up at Melissa, and in that moment, every ounce of her confidence evaporated. Her lawyer leaned toward her, whispering frantically, but she sat frozen, gripping the edge of the table as though it could keep her from drowning. The courtroom buzzed with curiosity, people leaning forward in their seats, trying to catch a glimpse of the papers that had made a federal judge laugh out loud. You see, those 2 pages weren't just documents, they were the truth Melissa had desperately hoped would never see the light of day. They were records, emails, and receipts that revealed her double life. For years, while claiming to be the dutiful wife sacrificing for her husband's success, she had been siphoning money from our joint accounts, funneling it into an online business registered under her cousin's name. This business wasn't small either, it had quietly grown into a 6-figure operation, all while she continued to play the role of the supportive but unrecognized partner at home. But that wasn't even the worst part. Buried in those pages were also exchanges, her own words, emails where she bragged to friends that she would take me for everything once the time was right. She had treated our marriage not as a union of love but as a waiting game, a setup for her eventual payday. The judge cleared his throat, his voice steady but tinged with amusement. Mrs. Melissa, he said, addressing her formally, do you deny that this evidence is in your own writing? Melissa's lips parted, but no sound came out. Her lawyer jumped up, objecting that the evidence was irrelevant, but the judge raised a hand, silencing him. Irrelevant? The judge said, arching an eyebrow. Counsel, if your client is suing for half of her husband's business claiming she sacrificed her own ambitions, yet here is documented proof that she has been running a separate profitable business in secret, then not only is this relevant, it strikes at the very heart of her credibility. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Some gasped, others shook their heads in disbelief, and I could hear a low whistle from someone in the back. Melissa's cheeks flushed crimson as she finally stammered, that business was, it was nothing serious, just a hobby. But the judge cut her off. A hobby that has generated nearly $200,000 in net profit over 3 years? A hobby where you explicitly wrote that you were waiting for the right time to take him for everything? Mrs. Melissa, the court is not in the business of rewarding deceit. His voice was firm now, the laughter replaced with steel. He leaned back in his chair, still shaking his head, as though trying to wrap his mind around the gall of what he had just read. Then, with a faint chuckle, he added, "Frankly, I've presided over hundreds of divorce cases, but this is one of the more brazen attempts I've seen to manipulate the truth." Melissa buried her face in her hands, whispering to her lawyer, but it was useless. The tide had turned completely. I sat there quietly, not gloating, not smirking, simply relieved that the truth had finally cut through the lies. And as I watched the judge tuck those papers back into the file, I realized something important, that sometimes, you don't need to shout, you don't need to fight dirty. Sometimes, all you need is patience, preparation, and the truth. And when truth arrives at the right moment, it has the power to silence even the loudest lies. The real turning point came when the judge leaned forward, tapping his pen on the desk, and said, "We will not move further until we verify the documents presented here." Those words sent a chill down her spine, and even though she tried to maintain her composure, I could see the faintest flicker of panic cross her face. The room grew quiet again, the kind of silence that made every breath feel louder than it should. My attorney stood with complete confidence, knowing that the foundation of her case was already collapsing. The judge began to read through the documents I had submitted, meticulously going line by line, occasionally raising an eyebrow or smirking as though he had just uncovered something that would completely dismantle her claim. The spectators in the courtroom leaned in, eager to witness what was about to unfold, because everyone could sense that the momentum of this battle had shifted. When the judge finally looked up, he didn't waste time on politeness. He directly asked her lawyer whether they were aware of the discrepancies in her financial claims. The hesitation from her side was almost embarrassing. It was clear they had either ignored the truth or thought no one would bother to check. Then the judge began pointing out specific lines in my wife's demands that didn't align with the actual financial records, showing that she had deliberately attempted to exaggerate her entitlement and conceal significant details of her own spending habits. She had transferred large sums of money into hidden accounts and had even attempted to reroute profits from one of the subsidiary businesses that she had no legal ownership of. Each revelation was like a hammer blow against her case, and with every strike, her confidence shrank while mine grew. For the first time since the trial began, I allowed myself to breathe a little easier, because I knew that the truth was standing firmly on my side. The judge finally leaned back in his chair, shook his head, and said with a tone of disbelief mixed with humor, "You came here demanding half of his business when in reality, you've been siphoning money behind his back. Do you understand how absurd this looks?" The gallery chuckled softly, the moment almost surreal, and I realized then that this wasn't just about protecting my business anymore, it was about exposing the lies that could have ruined everything I worked for. The final stretch of that courtroom battle felt like watching the truth shine through a storm cloud, exposing everything that had been hidden beneath layers of lies and manipulation. My wife, who had entered the room with arrogance, shoulders squared and eyes filled with the fire of entitlement, now sat slumped in her chair, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Her lawyer, clearly embarrassed, shuffled papers pointlessly, as if trying to salvage dignity from a case that had already been ripped apart. The judge, however, wasn't finished. He leaned forward again, this time with a voice that carried both authority and finality, and said, "In all my years on this bench, I rarely see such bold attempts to distort the truth. You tried to present yourself as a victim, but these documents prove you have been deceiving not only your husband but also this court." The weight of those words echoed across the room, and I felt the collective judgment of everyone present bearing down on her. At that moment, her facade completely collapsed, her lips trembled, her eyes welled up, and she realized the empire of lies she had built had crumbled in front of an audience that would never forget. The judge's ruling was swift and decisive. Not only was her demand for half of my business denied, but she was ordered to account for the funds she had siphoned and return assets that she had attempted to hide. The court went further, penalizing her with fines for filing misleading claims. It was more than a legal victory, it was moral justice. I could feel a rush of relief surge through me, but beneath that relief was also a deep ache. This wasn't how I had ever imagined our marriage ending, in a courtroom, dissecting lies and betrayal. Yet, life has a way of teaching lessons in the harshest of ways, and mine was now painfully clear. Trust, once broken, has consequences that no amount of money can fix. As I left the courtroom, people whispered, some even clapped lightly, as though acknowledging that integrity had prevailed. I looked up at the ceiling, breathed deeply, and allowed myself to smile, not out of spite, but because the truth had spoken louder than any false accusation ever could. To those watching, it may have seemed like the end of a drama, but to me, it was a beginning. A new chapter where I would move forward with clarity, free from manipulation, free from the weight of betrayal, and stronger than ever before. And if you're still with me at this point, let me remind you, stories like this are not just about one man's courtroom battle, they're about resilience, the courage to stand firm when you're under attack, and the power of truth to silence lies. If you believe in justice, if you believe in standing up for yourself when the odds feel overwhelming, then stay connected with us. Subscribe now, join this community, and never miss a story that shows how truth can turn even the darkest of situations into a moment of victory.